Most people think killers hide in shadows. But the truth? The most disturbing ones look ordinary. From America's forgotten highways to Europe's quiet neighborhoods, these men didn't just take lives. They rewrote the very rules of fear. One turned his home into a maze of traps. Another used his profession to lure victims who thought they were safe. And one of them? He walked free for years, leaving entire towns haunted by questions that never had answers. These are 6 of the most disturbing serial killers history has ever known. Each story darker than the last, each one a reminder that evil rarely looks like evil. Before we begin, tell me in the comments what country you're watching from, and make sure you subscribe, because what you're about to hear will stay with you long after this video ends. The smell was the first thing the plumber noticed. In February 1983, a routine call to clear a blocked drain in a quiet North London apartment building turned into the discovery of a nightmare. When workers opened the pipes, they found scraps of human flesh and clumps of hair floating in the wastewater. At first, they thought it was some grotesque prank, until the police traced the blockage back to the flat of a man named Dennis Nilsen. What they uncovered inside his small Muswell Hill home shocked Britain. Nilsen wasn't the type of figure anyone suspected of harboring darkness. A former police officer, civil servant, and seemingly polite neighbor, he lived quietly with his dog, kept mostly to himself, and blended into the rhythms of London life. But the drains told a story his neighbors never could have imagined. A story of multiple victims, lured with charm and promises of food, drink, or companionship, only to vanish forever within the walls of his flat. This wasn't a one-time crime, it was a pattern, and the drains were just the beginning of what he had been hiding. Nilsen's method of luring victims was deceptively simple. London in the late 1970s and early 1980s had no shortage of young men struggling to find work, shelter, or acceptance, and Nilsen positioned himself as someone willing to offer kindness. He haunted pubs, bus stops, and streets where vulnerable men drifted, often inviting them back to his flat with the promise of food, alcohol, or a warm place to stay. His demeanor disarmed suspicion. Tall, calm, and softly spoken, he appeared trustworthy. Once inside, however, the trap was sprung. Nilsen's quiet hospitality masked a deadly ritual. Many victims were offered drinks, conversation, even a cooked meal. But the night always ended the same way: strangulation or drowning, carried out with chilling efficiency. What horrified investigators was not only the killings themselves, but the way Nilsen treated the aftermath. He often kept the bodies in his flat for days, sometimes weeks, as though unable to let go, creating a grim double life where death shared space with ordinary domestic routines. By the time police searched his home, they found evidence that suggested at least a dozen men had fallen victim to his ritual. But here's where it gets really disturbing. The murders went unnoticed for years because the victims were often transient, living on society's margins, and their disappearances weren't immediately connected. Nilsen knew this and exploited it. His choice of victims wasn't random, it was calculated. He targeted those least likely to be missed quickly, those whose absence would raise the fewest alarms. This wasn't a frenzied killer striking blindly. This was a patient predator who built a routine, repeating it again and again while blending seamlessly back into ordinary life each morning. Neighbors saw him walking his dog. Co-workers described him as quiet but professional. No one suspected that behind the closed door of Flat 23 Cranley Gardens, Nilsen was constructing one of the most chilling chapters in British true crime. And yet, the drains betrayed him, the one part of his carefully built facade that he couldn't fully control. The drains weren't the only secret Dennis Nilsen had been hiding. They were just the first to betray him. Once police gained entry to his flat at Cranley Gardens, the reality was worse than anything they expected. Inside cupboards, under floorboards, and even in an old tea chest, investigators found human remains in varying stages of decay. It was a house of silence. No screams, no signs of struggle, only the eerie evidence of murders carried out methodically, then hidden with unsettling patience. Nielsen confessed with an almost casual air, explaining that he had killed 15 or 16 men, though he couldn't recall exact numbers. He spoke not like a man haunted by guilt, but like someone describing routines. He admitted he had boiled some remains to remove flesh from bone, flushed others down the toilet, and burned bones in the fireplace until they crumbled into ash. For Nielsen, disposing of victims was less about covering tracks in panic and more about extending control even after death. Each disposal was calculated, part of a chilling ritual that blurred the line between ordinary domesticity and unimaginable crime. What unsettled detectives most was the banality with which he lived among the evidence. He watched television while sitting in the same room where bodies lay hidden. He cooked meals with the smell of decay lingering in the air. His dog wandered freely through the flat, unfazed by the strange presence that had become part of its environment. For Nielsen, death had become normal. He admitted that he often kept bodies for days before disposing of them, speaking to them, positioning them in chairs as though they were still alive. He described this not as madness, but as loneliness, a need for companionship twisted into ritualized violence. To investigators, it was clear, Nielsen didn't just kill for the act of murder. He killed to create control, to build a world where no one could leave him, where silence replaced rejection, and where he could dictate the presence of others on his own terms. But here's where it gets really interesting. Despite the sheer number of victims, Nielsen might never have been caught if not for the drains. His earlier murders had been concealed during his time living at a different address on Melrose Avenue, where he burned and buried remains in the garden without anyone noticing. It was only when he moved to Cranley Gardens, a building without a garden, forcing him to rely on plumbing, that his careful system began to unravel. The blocked drains became his undoing, leading investigators straight to him. When confronted, he offered little resistance, almost as though he had been waiting for discovery. He guided detectives through his crimes with unnerving precision, showing little emotion as he recounted details that chilled even hardened officers. Yet for all his admissions, the full scope of his crimes may never be known. Many of his victims were never identified, transient young men whose lives slipped through the cracks of society just as their bodies slipped into Nielsen's drains. To this day, the true count remains uncertain, leaving open the question of how many lives he truly claimed. When Dennis Nielsen finally stood trial in 1983, the question wasn't whether he had killed, it was why. He had already confessed in unnerving detail, guiding police through his flats and recounting methods with a calmness that unsettled everyone in the courtroom. What prosecutors and psychologists wanted to uncover was the motive behind years of hidden killings. Nielsen himself claimed that his crimes weren't about cruelty, but about loneliness. He described himself as a man terrified of abandonment, someone who wanted companions who could never leave. In his twisted view, murder was a way of keeping people near him, creating relationships that could not dissolve. To the jury, these explanations were as chilling as the crimes themselves. They weren't hearing from a man consumed by rage or outbursts of madness. They were listening to someone who planned, carried out, and concealed murders as though they were extensions of his daily life. That calmness, paired with the sheer number of victims, left an impression that Britain had not seen since Jack the Ripper. The evidence prosecutors presented painted a picture of a man who had lived a double life. By day, he was a civil servant, blending into the bureaucracy of London. By night, he hunted for men in pubs, lured them back with charm, and carried out killings that became ritual. Witnesses described him as soft-spoken, polite, and intelligent, which made his confessions even more difficult to reconcile. He didn't look like the archetypal predator. He looked ordinary, and that ordinariness became part of the horror. During the trial, forensic experts detailed how he disposed of remains, how he used fires, drains, and hidden floorboards to cover his tracks. Each description pulled the jury deeper into a world where death and domesticity coexisted seamlessly. The chilling part wasn't only the murders themselves, but the way Nielsen continued living among the dead as if nothing were wrong. That sense of normalization, of murder becoming routine, was what left jurors and the public shaken. In November 1983, Dennis Nielsen was found guilty of 6 counts of murder and 2 counts of attempted murder. He was sentenced to life imprisonment with a recommendation that he never be released. For the families of his victims, the verdict brought some measure of closure, but the unanswered questions lingered. How many victims truly died at his hands? How many names would never be known, their identities lost to time and Nielsen's meticulous concealment? Even in prison, Nielsen remained a figure of morbid fascination. He wrote memoirs, gave interviews, and maintained the same calm detachment he had shown throughout the trial. To the public, his name became synonymous with hidden evil, the kind that lives next door, walks its dog in the morning, and blends so completely into society that no one suspects a thing. The case of Dennis Nielsen remains one of the most disturbing in British history, not just because of the killings, but because of what it revealed: that sometimes the most dangerous predator isn't the one you see coming, but the one you never notice at all. Nielsen turned his quiet London flats into places of silence and death, hiding his crimes for years. But across the Atlantic, in America's Midwest, another killer was creating a world of horror behind closed doors. A man whose house would later be called a crime scene unlike anything police had ever witnessed. His name was John Wayne Gacy, and his mask of respectability was even more terrifying than the clown makeup he sometimes wore. The stench hit officers before the first shovel broke the earth. In December 1978, Chicago police searching the crawl space beneath John Wayne Gacy's modest suburban home uncovered what at first looked like bundles of rags. But as they pulled back the dirt, they realized the truth. Human remains, stacked and buried in layers. Dozens of victims hidden just beneath the floorboards of a house that looked as ordinary as any other in the neighborhood. Neighbors had long described Gacy as a friendly man, the type who hosted block parties, dressed up as a clown for children's events, and seemed devoted to community life. He was a contractor, a business owner, even photographed with politicians, the picture of respectability. Yet beneath the laughter, the clown makeup, and the suburban normalcy lay one of the most chilling crime scenes in American history. The discovery at Gacy's home marked the unraveling of a secret he had cultivated for years, a pattern of killings that turned his house into a graveyard. What made Gacy so terrifying was how effectively he used his public image as a shield. He was known in Chicago not just as a neighbor, but as a man who gave back. He entertained children as Pogo the Clown, performed at fundraisers, and projected the image of someone safe, trustworthy, even lovable. This persona allowed him to move through the community unnoticed, even as young men began disappearing around him. He targeted victims who were often vulnerable: drifters, teenagers looking for work, or young men from troubled backgrounds, promising them jobs in construction or quick cash for labor. Many accepted, grateful for the opportunity. They had no way of knowing that stepping into Gacy's house meant stepping into a trap they would never escape. Police would later say his clown persona wasn't just entertainment, it was camouflage, a mask that allowed him to get close to victims while deflecting suspicion. But here's where it gets really disturbing. Gacy didn't just kill. He orchestrated an environment where murder became part of the structure of his home. His crawl space, dark, cramped, and accessible only through a narrow opening, became his chosen place of concealment. Each new victim was buried in shallow graves beneath the house, layered atop one another until the space could hold no more. The smell of decay was sometimes noticeable, but Gacy dismissed it as plumbing problems or mold, explanations his neighbors accepted. The chilling reality was that while the neighborhood children laughed at the clown who performed at their parties, the ground beneath his feet concealed a nightmare. By the time investigators fully searched his property, they uncovered the remains of 29 victims, with others discarded in nearby rivers. John Wayne Gacy's home was not just a crime scene. It was a monument to how deception and charm can mask horror, allowing a killer to live in plain sight while building one of the darkest legacies in American true crime. Gacy's method of luring victims was as calculated as it was chilling. He often presented himself as an opportunity, dangling jobs, money, or even just companionship to young men who were desperate or adrift. Many of his victims were runaways, high school kids in need of quick work, or youths rejected by family and society. Gacy knew exactly how to exploit their vulnerabilities. He would approach them on the street, at bus stations, or through casual conversations in his community. Sometimes he targeted those who already knew him, offering steady wages with his construction company. To these young men, Gacy seemed like a chance at stability, a safe option in a city where opportunities were scarce. But stepping into his home meant stepping into a carefully prepared stage where charm quickly turned into control. He employed tricks, handcuffs presented as part of a magic act, promises of beer and conversation, only to use them as traps once the victim let their guard down. What began as hospitality often ended in silence, the boy's last moments concealed behind the closed doors of a suburban house that seemed as harmless as any other. For years, no one connected the disappearances. Chicago in the 1970s was a city of constant movement, and when teenagers vanished, police often assumed they had run away or left voluntarily. Gacy relied on that. He targeted those least likely to be immediately reported missing or aggressively pursued by authorities. Families searched, posters went up, but in most cases, the connection between victims was invisible to investigators. Gacy seemed untouchable, shielded by his community reputation and his outward respectability. Even when neighbors noticed strange smells seeping from his crawl space, he explained it away as backed-up plumbing, and the explanation was accepted. The chilling part wasn't just the number of victims, but how effectively he managed to operate in plain sight, turning charm into his deadliest weapon. It was a mask that fooled nearly everyone, including police, who questioned him more than once without realizing the enormity of what he was hiding. But here's where it gets really interesting. Gacy's downfall didn't come from a clever detective breakthrough or a dramatic mistake. It came from persistence. In late 1978, the disappearance of 15-year-old Robert Piest raised alarms in a way that other cases had not. Unlike many of Gacy's victims, Piest came from a stable family who immediately insisted he would never have left on his own. Witnesses placed him at a pharmacy where Gacy had been that same evening, talking to the boy about a job. When police questioned Gacy, he denied everything, projecting his usual calm and charm. But suspicions mounted. Detectives began surveillance, and what they saw disturbed them. Gacy visiting bars late at night, disposing of items, acting increasingly erratic. Slowly, the evidence built. Missing person reports lined up with times when Gacy had been in contact with youths. A search warrant turned up personal items belonging to victims, contradicting his denials. The illusion was cracking, and for the first time, the mask of the killer clown began to slip. By December 1978, the walls were closing in. After weeks of surveillance, police finally obtained a full search warrant for John Wayne Gacy's home. What they uncovered beneath the crawl space shocked even the most seasoned investigators. Layer after layer of shallow graves revealed bodies stacked atop one another, a hidden graveyard that had existed beneath the feet of neighbors, friends, and children for years without detection. In total, 29 victims were recovered from his property, with additional remains found in nearby rivers where Gacy had discarded those he no longer had room to bury. When confronted with the evidence, Gacy's composure cracked. He began to talk, confessing to dozens of killings in a tone that was disturbingly matter-of-fact. He described how he lured boys, how he trapped them, and how he buried them beneath his house. To police, it was less a confession of guilt than a recital of routine. Gacy didn't weep or beg for forgiveness. He spoke as if recounting business transactions, revealing just how detached he was from the humanity of his victims. The trial that followed in 1980 became one of the most notorious in American criminal history. Prosecutors laid out a chilling timeline of abductions and murders, backed by physical evidence from his home and testimony from surviving witnesses. The sheer number of victims made the case almost overwhelming, forcing the court to piece together the identities of young men who had disappeared without explanation. Gacy's defense attempted to argue insanity, claiming he had dissociative identity disorder and that his alter ego, the clown, had committed the crimes. But jurors weren't convinced. They saw instead a man who had carefully built a double life, respected businessman by day, predator by night, and who had exploited his community's trust to commit murders on an unprecedented scale. The courtroom atmosphere was electric, filled with grief-stricken families who finally had answers but no relief. Each new piece of testimony deepened the portrait of a man who had turned his suburban home into a slaughterhouse disguised as a safe haven. In March 1980, John Wayne Gacy was convicted of 33 murders and sentenced to death. For 14 years, he remained on death row, appealing his conviction but never escaping the weight of his crimes. In 1994, he was executed by lethal injection. Even at the end, Gacy remained defiant, reportedly saying, "Kiss my ass," as his final words. To the public, his name became synonymous with hidden evil, the very idea that a man could host neighborhood parties, dress as a clown for children, and bury victims beneath his house unsettled America in a way few cases ever have. His crimes forced a reckoning with the notion that predators don't always look dangerous. Sometimes they wear a smile, shake your hand, and perform tricks at your child's birthday party. John Wayne Gacy's legacy remains one of the darkest in American history, a reminder that the most terrifying monsters are often the ones we never see coming, hiding behind masks of normalcy until it is far too late. Gacy's crawl space revealed the horrors that can lurk behind a suburban facade. But across the Atlantic, another predator was operating with a different mask. Not the paint of a clown, but the respectability of a trusted doctor. His patients never suspected the man they relied on for care was secretly deciding who would live and who would die. His name was Harold Shipman, and he would go on to become one of the most prolific serial killers in modern history. The death certificates piled up on his desk, each one signed with the calm authority of a trusted physician. But hidden inside those signatures was a pattern no one wanted to believe. For years, in the quiet town of Hyde, England, families buried their loved ones under the assumption that they had simply succumbed to old age or illness. The man who declared their passing was Dr. Harold Shipman, a respected general practitioner who had treated entire families for decades. He visited homes, prescribed medicine, and carried himself with the steady confidence of a professional devoted to care. Patients trusted him implicitly. Neighbors described him as reliable, courteous, and always available in emergencies. But beneath that image of stability, Shipman was orchestrating one of the most chilling medical betrayals in modern history. While his patients and their families believed they were receiving compassion, Shipman was quietly injecting them with lethal doses of diamorphine, a drug intended for pain relief, but lethal when abused. Each death was noted as natural, each funeral a quiet affair, and no one suspected that the man in the white coat was the very reason their loved ones had never woken up. Shipman's story is terrifying because it subverted the foundation of trust between doctor and patient. Unlike killers who stalked strangers or preyed upon the vulnerable from outside, Shipman embedded himself in the very role society relies on for safety, the healer. He exploited the faith that people instinctively placed in their doctors. Elderly patients welcomed him into their homes, grateful for his attention. Families rarely questioned his pronouncements because who would doubt a doctor? This dynamic gave Shipman extraordinary power, and he used it with chilling precision. His victims were mostly older women, though his range extended beyond that. He often chose patients who lived alone or whose families weren't present during visits, ensuring that there would be fewer questions when death came swiftly. With a quick injection and a doctor's note, Shipman transformed murder into routine, cloaking his crimes in the legitimacy of medical practice. But here's where it gets even more disturbing. Shipman didn't act out of desperation, financial gain, or panic. His killings were deliberate, systematic, and sustained for decades. He didn't leave crime scenes filled with chaos or evidence. Instead, he left behind tidy narratives of natural death. And because of his position, those narratives were rarely challenged. Local undertakers began noticing that many of Shipman's patients had died unexpectedly, often sitting fully dressed in chairs rather than lying in bed as one might expect. A colleague also grew uneasy at the unusually high number of cremation forms Shipman asked families to sign. Yet even then, suspicion was slow to build. It wasn't until patterns of forged wills, suspicious death rates, and the sheer number of his certifications came under scrutiny that investigators realized the scope of what he had done. By then, hundreds of deaths were already tied to his name. The horrifying question remained: how many lives had been taken by a doctor whose very profession was supposed to save them? For years, Harold Shipman's crimes were hidden in plain sight, cloaked by his medical authority, but small cracks began to appear in the facade. Local undertakers noticed an unsettling pattern. Many of Shipman's patients died sitting upright in chairs, fully clothed, often without warning signs of decline. This was unusual. The elderly typically pass away bedridden, often after prolonged illness. Yet, under Shipman's care, death arrived suddenly, and always with his calm reassurance that it had been peaceful and expected. Families, grieving and trusting, rarely questioned it. But the undertakers whispered among themselves, wondering why so many of his patients seemed to die alone, with no one present but the doctor. Suspicion also grew among fellow medical professionals. One colleague noted the sheer number of cremation forms Shipman requested, often pressing families to choose cremation quickly, with him volunteering to handle the paperwork. And then there were the wills. Several patients, all elderly women, had inexplicably altered their wills to benefit Shipman shortly before their deaths. For a time, each of these warning signs seemed isolated, but slowly they began to form a pattern too disturbing to ignore. The tipping point came with the death of Kathleen Grundy, a wealthy, well-respected woman in Hyde in 1998. She was found dead at home, and Shipman, as usual, certified the cause as natural. But her daughter, a solicitor, was immediately suspicious. Kathleen had been in good health, with no sign of serious illness. Even stranger, her will had been altered to leave nearly her entire estate to Shipman, cutting her family out entirely. The forgery was clumsy, and her daughter recognized it instantly as fake. She alerted the authorities, and for the first time, investigators began to treat Shipman not as a trusted doctor, but as a suspect. They exhumed Grundy's body, and toxicology tests revealed lethal levels of diamorphine, the drug Shipman had long used to carry out his killings. The mask had slipped. What had looked like natural deaths were now revealed as calculated murders committed with the very drugs patients trusted him to administer. But here's where it gets even more staggering. As police dug deeper, they realized Grundy's case was only the beginning. They launched what became one of the largest criminal investigations in British history, exhuming multiple bodies, reviewing thousands of medical records, and interviewing families who all told eerily similar stories. Again and again, they heard of sudden deaths, all pronounced by Shipman, often with little to no warning. Statistical analysis showed that his patients were dying at a rate far higher than those of any other local doctor. The numbers were impossible to ignore. Police discovered that Shipman had been quietly killing since at least the 1970s, his methods so consistent and his role so trusted that no one had thought to question him. By the time investigators compiled the evidence, the estimated number of victims climbed into the hundreds. The idea that a single man, a doctor no less, could have ended so many lives without detection was almost beyond comprehension. And yet, with every file reviewed and every exhumation conducted, the horrifying truth became undeniable. Harold Shipman wasn't just a killer. He was one of the most prolific serial murderers in recorded history. When Harold Shipman was finally arrested in September 1998, the shockwave rippled far beyond Hyde. This wasn't a shadowy drifter or an eccentric loner like so many killers before him. This was a respected doctor, the kind of man families trusted with their most intimate fears and final moments. Police charged him initially with forging Kathleen Grundy's will and her murder, but as investigators pored over decades of cases, the numbers multiplied. They found medical records altered to justify sudden deaths, death certificates signed with suspicious speed, and cremation forms rushed through with Shipman's signature. The evidence was damning, but the scale was even worse. Experts analyzing the data concluded that Shipman had likely killed more than 200 patients over a span of 2 decades. Some estimates suggested the number could be closer to 250. It was a figure so staggering that prosecutors had to narrow their focus, selecting 15 deaths they could prove beyond doubt, with Kathleen Grundy's case as the cornerstone. The trial began in October 1999, and the courtroom atmosphere was unlike anything Britain had seen in modern times. Families of victims filled the benches, listening as prosecutors outlined the chilling consistency of Shipman's methods. Time after time, elderly patients had died shortly after visits from him, with lethal levels of diamorphine coursing through their systems. Witnesses described the suddenness of these deaths, often occurring in moments when the patients had been relatively stable. The prosecution also presented evidence of Shipman's arrogance, his belief that his status as a doctor placed him above suspicion. The forged will, in particular, revealed not only his greed, but his confidence that no one would dare question him. His defense team argued that the deaths were coincidental, that the patients had been ill, and that statistical anomalies did not prove murder. But the toxicology reports, the forged documents, and the sheer volume of suspicious deaths painted a picture too damning to dismiss. On January 31, 2000, Harold Shipman was convicted of 15 counts of murder and 1 count of forgery. He was sentenced to life imprisonment, with the judge recommending he never be released. For the families of his victims, the verdict brought relief but also left a haunting question. How had this gone unnoticed for so long? Shipman's case shook the foundations of British medicine. Trust in doctors, once considered almost absolute, was suddenly fragile. If a man like Shipman could abuse his position to such an extent, could it happen again? In the years following his conviction, sweeping reforms were introduced in medical oversight, prescription tracking, and death certification. His name became shorthand for betrayal on the deepest level, the healer who kills. Even decades later, the legacy of Harold Shipman is not just the hundreds of lives he ended, but the way he forced society to confront an uncomfortable truth that evil can hide behind the most trusted professions, and that vigilance is the only defense against those who weaponize trust itself. Shipman exploited the trust placed in doctors to carry out his crimes, showing how power and authority can become a mask for horror. But in Germany, another killer was waiting. The pot simmering on Joachim Kroll's stove was the first thing officers noticed, and what floated inside made their stomachs turn. It was July 3, 1976, when German police entered his dingy Duisburg apartment in the Ruhr region. They had been called about a blocked pipe in the building, and plumbers who investigated found something that didn't belong in a sewer system: pieces of human flesh. The trail led them upstairs to the apartment of a quiet, awkward man most neighbors described as pitiful rather than threatening. Inside, the walls were stained, the air reeked of decay, and in the kitchen sat a cooking pot containing what officers first thought was boiled meat. But this wasn't pork or beef. It was part of a young girl who had gone missing only days earlier. Joachim Kroll, a 43-year-old factory worker, looked up at them with the same blank, childlike stare he had always worn in public. The man the community had dismissed as harmless was suddenly revealed as one of the most disturbing killers Germany had ever seen. What shocked investigators most wasn't just the pot on the stove, but how easily Kroll confessed. When questioned about the flesh in the pipes, he admitted calmly that he had disposed of parts of his victim that way, believing it would solve the problem of getting rid of bodies. When asked about the pot, he explained with chilling simplicity that he sometimes cooked and ate portions of his victims, insisting it was practical. "Meat is expensive," he said. To detectives, it was clear they weren't dealing with a man trying to deny his crimes, but someone who had lived with them so long that he saw no need to hide. And that casualness made the case even more horrifying. How had this man, socially awkward, slow-witted, and considered odd but not dangerous, managed to kill again and again without drawing serious suspicion? The answer lay in post-war Germany itself. The Ruhr area, still recovering from devastation, was filled with transient workers, families in poverty, and communities where children often roamed unsupervised. Kroll, who worked in low-paying factory jobs, blended into this environment as just another face in the crowd. He was strange, yes. Neighbors described him as reclusive, with a childlike demeanor, but he didn't seem threatening. That perception allowed him to approach children and young women, offering small kindnesses or simply taking advantage of moments when they were alone. His victims ranged from young girls to adult women, attacked in parks, fields, and sometimes snatched from the streets. Kroll's crimes began as early as the late 1950s, yet for decades, police never connected the string of murders and disappearances scattered across the region. Each case seemed isolated, a tragedy but not part of a larger pattern. The notion that a man like Kroll, meek, odd, seemingly incapable of violence, could be behind them simply didn't register. But here's where it gets really disturbing. Kroll's killings were not frenzied outbursts. They were deliberate, repeated, and chillingly calculated in their simplicity. He would strangle or stab his victims quickly, avoiding noise, then assault the bodies and sometimes cut away portions of flesh. He often returned to crime scenes later, revisiting them as though compelled by a need to relive the act. Each time, he escaped detection, walking back to his job or his apartment as though nothing had happened. He didn't fit the image of a predator that police expected. He wasn't charming, intelligent, or socially adept like some infamous killers. Instead, he was awkward, withdrawn, and easily overlooked. And that very ordinariness, that ability to vanish into the background, allowed him to keep killing for nearly 20 years. By the time police arrested him in 1976, Kroll admitted to more than a dozen murders. Some estimates suggest the real number was higher. For investigators standing in his filthy apartment, staring at the pot on the stove, the realization was inescapable. This wasn't just a killer. This was a man who had lived alongside an entire community, preying on it quietly, turning its children and women into victims while no one saw the danger standing right in front of them. For nearly 2 decades, Joachim Kroll's crimes unfolded in the shadows, a string of disappearances and killings that seemed random at first glance, but carried his quiet signature. His earliest known murder dates back to 1955, when a young girl went missing while playing outside in the town of Duisburg. Her body was later discovered, showing signs of strangulation. At the time, police suspected a drifter, a stranger passing through, but Kroll, the awkward young man living nearby, was never considered. This would become a recurring pattern. The victims were found, but the killer was invisible, hiding in plain sight. Over the next 20 years, Kroll would kill again and again, targeting children, teenagers, and women in isolated moments when they were most vulnerable. Parks, riverbanks, fields, all became hunting grounds for a man who looked too timid to be dangerous. Each crime left families shattered and police baffled, but no one pieced them together as the work of a single predator. Part of what allowed Kroll to operate so long was his ability to mask his crimes with the chaos of post-war Germany. The 1950s and 1960s in the Ruhr Valley were marked by population shifts, poverty, and transient workers moving in and out of towns. Disappearances were often chalked up to runaways, accidents, or opportunistic strangers. Kroll exploited this uncertainty. He was methodical in his choice of victims, often selecting those who were alone or from families that lacked the power to press authorities for full investigations. In some cases, the deaths were blamed on other suspected killers, as West Germany grappled with crime in its rebuilding years. Kroll benefited from the assumptions of both police and the public that someone like him, a slow, socially awkward factory worker who seemed childlike in intelligence, couldn't possibly commit such calculated acts. That underestimation was his camouflage, and it allowed him to hunt undisturbed. But here's where it gets even more disturbing. Kroll didn't just kill once and stop. Each murder seemed to feed a compulsion that grew stronger over time. His methods remained brutally consistent. He would lure victims with the promise of toys, candy, or simply by catching them alone, then quickly strangle or stab them to silence them before carrying out his twisted rituals. Afterward, he often returned to the crime scenes, sometimes days later, to relive what he had done. Investigators would later discover that he sometimes cut away portions of flesh, which he admitted to cooking and eating. This wasn't about survival or hunger. It was about obsession, control, and a compulsion that defined his existence. And yet, despite the grotesque details, no one suspected him. Neighbors thought of Kroll as odd but harmless, describing him as quiet, timid, and not very bright. He lived alone, worked menial jobs, and rarely drew attention to himself. In the eyes of those around him, he was almost pitiable, a man who seemed too simple-minded to cause harm. But behind closed doors, that simplicity hid a predator who knew exactly how to strike and vanish, leaving behind a trail of bodies that stretched across the Ruhr without anyone realizing the same man was responsible. When Joachim Kroll finally confessed, it wasn't with the drama of a criminal mastermind or the defiance of a hardened predator. It was with the flat, almost childlike honesty of a man who never understood the enormity of what he had done. After police entered his apartment in July 1976 and discovered flesh in his drains and the cooking pot on his stove, Kroll didn't resist. He calmly told investigators about his crimes, recounting murders stretching back more than 2 decades. To the astonishment of detectives, he spoke as if describing routine errands rather than lives taken. He admitted to killing 13 people, though suspicions later suggested his victim count may have been higher. What stunned officers was the detail he remembered: names, locations, methods. He explained that he strangled or stabbed his victims quickly, that he sometimes cut flesh to eat because it saved money, and that he disposed of bodies in rivers, fields, or disastrously, in his last case, the plumbing system. His matter-of-fact tone chilled everyone in the interrogation room. He wasn't trying to excuse himself, but he also wasn't expressing remorse. For Kroll, the killings were simply facts of his life, carried out in secret until they became impossible to hide. The trial that followed in 1982 turned him into a grim spectacle. Psychiatrists debated his mental capacity, describing him as a man of below-average intelligence, socially stunted, and emotionally childlike. Yet his ability to kill repeatedly, conceal his crimes, and mislead authorities for decades suggested a cunning beneath the surface. Prosecutors argued that regardless of his intelligence, Kroll knew what he was doing. He targeted vulnerable victims, avoided capture for years, and admitted that he acted to satisfy urges he could not control. Families of victims packed the courtroom, listening in horror as Kroll recounted how he had lured their loved ones, killed them, and in some cases revisited their remains. The public was shocked not only by his actions, but by the banality of his appearance. Photographs of Kroll showed an unremarkable balding man with thick glasses, the kind of neighbor you might ignore in passing. To realize that such a man had carried out killings for over 20 years, unnoticed, was a national trauma. In 1982, Joachim Kroll was convicted of 8 murders and 1 attempted murder. He was sentenced to life imprisonment, where he lived out his days until his death in 1991. For Germany, his case became one of the most disturbing revelations of post-war life, not just because of the crimes themselves, but because of how long they went undetected. Police had investigated countless suspects over the years, chasing leads, blaming other men, and missing the quiet predator in their midst. Neighbors who had pitied Kroll as a harmless oddball now faced the reality that they had been living beside a killer who preyed on children and women while blending into the background of their community. The case of Joachim Kroll forced Germany to confront uncomfortable questions. How could a man so ordinary commit such horrors? How many victims had been lost simply because no one believed the predator could be someone like him? And perhaps most chilling of all, how many others like him might still be hiding in plain sight, unnoticed, waiting for the next opportunity? Kroll's blank stare and childlike demeanor made him the kind of predator no one suspected, a man who used ordinariness as camouflage. But decades earlier in Hungary, another seemingly respectable man hid a nightmare in plain sight. When authorities opened sealed metal barrels in his garden, they uncovered one of Europe's most haunting murder cases. His name was Bela Kiss, and what lay inside those barrels shocked the world. The stench of decay rolled out the moment the first barrel was pried open. It was 1916 in the quiet Hungarian town of Cinkota, when soldiers, tasked with inspecting the home of a man conscripted into the army, discovered something no one expected. Dozens of large metal drums were buried or stacked around the garden and outbuildings of a man named Bela Kiss, a tinsmith known locally for his politeness, good looks, and seemingly respectable life. At first, neighbors assumed the barrels contained fuel or supplies, as Kiss had told them he was stockpiling in case of wartime shortages. But when police cracked one open, they found not oil, but the preserved body of a woman. her skin pale, her throat marked with signs of strangulation. Shock spread as one barrel after another was opened. In total, over 20 women's bodies, each stored in a vat of metal, preserved in alcohol. The charming tinsmith, with a reputation as a hard worker and amateur astrologer, was suddenly revealed to be hiding one of the most grotesque collections of victims Europe had ever seen. Investigators soon learned that Kiss had been leading a double life. Outwardly, he was polite, well-dressed, and often admired for his intelligence and manners. He lived in a modest home but was known for his romantic interests, often corresponding with women through personal ads in newspapers. At a time when many women were widowed or unmarried due to the war, Kiss presented himself as a lonely but respectable gentleman looking for companionship. He promised marriage, security, and a fresh start, and women responded in droves. They came to his home, sometimes bringing savings or personal belongings, expecting a future together. Instead, they vanished. To their families, it seemed they had eloped or moved away. To police, until the discovery of the barrels, these disappearances went unnoticed. Kiss had crafted the perfect ruse, a romantic predator operating in plain sight, using letters and charm as his weapons. But here's where it gets even more disturbing. Bela Kiss wasn't just a fraudster or opportunist. The evidence in his home revealed he had planned his crimes meticulously. Each woman had been strangled, likely with a rope or wire, and her body carefully preserved in alcohol-filled drums, as if Kiss wanted to keep them near him forever. Police found dozens of letters from lonely women across Hungary and beyond, each one a potential victim lured by promises of love. In his study, they discovered books on poisons, strangulation, and astrology, a strange mix that suggested both obsession and ritual. And yet, despite the grisly evidence, Kiss himself was nowhere to be found. Drafted into the Austro-Hungarian army at the start of World War I, he had left town before the barrels were discovered. Rumors swirled. Some claimed he died in battle, others that he deserted and fled abroad. His neighbors, once charmed by his manners, now recoiled in horror, realizing the quiet tinsmith next door had turned his garden into a graveyard of promises broken. For investigators, the open barrels were only the beginning of a mystery that would haunt them for decades. Had Bela Kiss truly died in the war, or had he vanished into the world, free to kill again under another name? The barrels revealed the horror, but the letters revealed the method. As police combed through Bela Kiss's modest home after the grisly discovery in 1916, they found stacks of correspondence hidden away. Hundreds of letters exchanged with women across Hungary, Austria, and even further afield. These were not casual notes, but carefully constructed love letters, written in the flowery style of a gentleman promising devotion and security. In an era when war had left many women widowed, unmarried, or desperate for stability, Kiss's words struck a chord. He advertised in newspapers, presenting himself as a lonely widower of means-seeking companionship. Women responded eagerly, often sending photographs, tokens of affection, and promises of money to help start their supposed new life together. Time and again, Kiss arranged meetings at his Sinkota home. Neighbors saw women arriving with suitcases, sometimes carrying savings or jewelry, but they never saw them leave. Kiss always had explanations ready. The women had left for Budapest, or moved abroad, or eloped quietly. For years, these excuses were accepted, and the trail of missing women stretched on unnoticed. Investigators pieced together a disturbing pattern. Kiss didn't just lure women for financial gain, though many victims had turned over their savings before vanishing. He seemed driven by something darker, an obsession with possession and control. Each victim was strangled, her body preserved in alcohol-filled barrels that were sealed tight and hidden around his property. Police theorized that Kiss chose alcohol because it prevented decomposition, allowing him to keep his victims intact like trophies. This was no hurried burial or panicked cover-up. This was careful, deliberate, and chillingly ritualistic. The discovery of these preserved bodies suggested that Kiss not only killed but wanted to return to his victims, to keep them near him as if the promise of companionship had been fulfilled in his own twisted way. The meticulous preservation of bodies turned his crimes into something more than murder. They became an obsession with creating permanence in relationships that had never truly existed. But here's where the story twists into mystery. When police issued a warrant for Kiss's arrest, they discovered he had been drafted into the Austro-Hungarian army at the outbreak of World War I and was serving on the front lines in Serbia. Initial reports claimed he had died in battle, but investigators remained skeptical. Multiple witnesses later claimed to have seen him alive after the war, in Hungary and even abroad. In 1924, a Hungarian soldier reported encountering a man who resembled Kiss in a French Foreign Legion barracks in Algeria. Another alleged sighting placed him in New York, working as a janitor. Each lead reignited the hunt, but none were confirmed. The possibility that Bela Kiss had escaped justice haunted investigators for decades. Unlike many killers whose fates are sealed with arrest and trial, Kiss's story remained open-ended. His barrels told the world what he had done, but his absence left a question that was never answered. Did the gentleman killer continue his crimes under a new name, hidden far from the barrels in his garden? For the families of his victims, the lack of closure was as haunting as the crimes themselves. Even after the barrels were emptied and the victims laid to rest, the shadow of Bela Kiss refused to fade. The police investigation had unearthed more than 20 bodies, each preserved with the same macabre precision, each linked to a woman who had once answered his personal ads. Yet the man himself had slipped away, leaving only rumors, sightings, and speculation. For the Hungarian public, the case became an obsession not only because of the scale of the murders, but because of the unresolved ending. Here was a killer who had lured women with promises of love, strangled them, sealed their bodies in alcohol, and stored them like possessions in his garden, and then, at the crucial moment, vanished. Newspapers across Europe carried his name, embellishing his story with rumors of occult practices, vampirism, and secret societies. In truth, the details were chilling enough without the myths. Kiss had exploited loneliness and vulnerability in a time of war, turning hope for companionship into a death sentence. But what unsettled people most was that he was never seen in handcuffs, never stood trial, never faced justice. His absence became as haunting as his crimes. Over the years, sightings of Kiss surfaced sporadically, each one fueling the legend. A man resembling him was reportedly seen in Romania, then in France, then in America. In 1932, a police officer in New York claimed to have spotted him working as a janitor, but the man vanished before he could be arrested. None of these accounts were ever confirmed, but each was plausible enough to keep investigators guessing. Could a man who had killed so many really blend into a new life unnoticed? The idea was terrifying. If Kiss had escaped Hungary during the chaos of the First World War, he might have continued his pattern elsewhere, his barrels buried in foreign soil, his victims recorded only as missing women whose disappearances were never linked. The lack of closure gnawed at authorities and families alike. Every new missing person case in Central Europe seemed to echo his methods, even when evidence proved otherwise. The man with the barrels became a ghost story whispered across borders, a reminder that evil could slip away and never be caught. But here's where the story becomes most chilling. Historians today still debate whether Bela Kiss died a soldier's death in 1916 or lived on under a new identity. The official record lists him as missing in action, but the sightings, the rumors, and the uncanny reports of a man who looked just like him suggest otherwise. If he survived, he may have been one of the few serial killers in history to vanish so completely after being discovered, leaving behind not only his crimes, but the possibility of more. For Hungary, his name became legend, etched into true crime history as both murderer and mystery. The barrels told the world what he had done, but the unanswered question of his fate is what made him unforgettable. Unlike killers who end in capture or execution, Kiss's story ends with an open door, a chilling possibility that somewhere, beyond the war-torn borders of his homeland, he walked free, carrying his secrets with him. And for investigators, that was the most disturbing part. Not just the horror of what he left behind, but the fear of what he might have done next, if indeed he had escaped. Bela Kiss's barrels revealed a killer who vanished before justice could reach him, leaving behind a legend of mystery and dread. But half a world away, in Australia, another case would shake an entire community. This time not a vanished stranger, but a stepmother who lived under the same roof as her victims. Her name was Martha Rendell, and her crimes blurred the line between maternal care and calculated murder. The townspeople whispered when the third child died. In the working-class suburb of East Perth, Australia, at the turn of the 20th century, tragedy seemed to stalk the Rendell household. First, one of the Phillips children fell ill and wasted away, doctors writing it off as a common infection. Then another. By the time the third was carried to the graveyard, neighbors were unsettled. Illness was not uncommon in 1908, but 3 children from the same family dying in quick succession seemed more than coincidence. And yet, through it all, their stepmother, Martha Rendell, stood by the bedside, administering medicine with the devotion of a caretaker. She held spoons of syrup to their lips, wiped their brows, and told anyone who asked that she was doing everything she could to save them. But behind her calm exterior, something darker was at work. Because the medicine she was spoon-feeding the children wasn't curing them, it was killing them. To the outside world, Martha had assumed the role of a devoted stepmother after moving in with her partner, Thomas Nichols, and his children. She seemed dutiful, present, and attentive, filling the maternal role left vacant in their lives. But the children quickly began to complain of burning throats and searing pain after taking the medicine she provided. At first, doctors believed they were suffering from diphtheria or scarlet fever, both common illnesses in that era. Symptoms like throat swelling, difficulty swallowing, and gradual wasting matched what physicians expected. No one thought to question whether the cure itself was the cause. Rendell's alleged medicine contained hydrochloric acid, a corrosive substance she mixed into syrups and tonics, disguising it as treatment. Each dose caused unbearable agony, scarring throats and eventually leading to death. The children's pleas were dismissed as illness, their cries of pain attributed to the infection rather than the very remedy their stepmother administered. But here's where it gets even more disturbing. Rendell seemed to thrive on the process of their decline. Witnesses later claimed she was almost obsessive about tending to the children, hovering by their bedsides, carefully administering doses, and watching intently as they writhed. Some suggested she derived a grim satisfaction from their suffering, though whether it was sadism or a warped sense of control remains unclear. What is certain is that while the community initially saw her as a devoted caretaker, suspicion began to grow as the deaths continued. Neighbors whispered about the pattern, and even doctors, though reluctant to accuse a stepmother openly, noted the unusual number of fatalities under her roof. Still, without proof, Rendell's secret remained hidden, and she continued her role as the grieving, dutiful woman who somehow kept losing the very children she was meant to protect. It would take the intervention of investigators and the suspicions of outsiders to finally uncover what had been happening behind closed doors in the Rendell household, and to reveal Martha not as a grieving mother, but as one of Australia's most chilling figures of domestic murder. By the time the third Phillips child was buried, whispers had turned into unease, and unease into suspicion. Neighbors began to speak more openly about the strange pattern inside the Rendell home. Illness was one thing, but 3 young lives ending in quick succession under the same roof, each with similar symptoms, raised questions no one could ignore. Children playing in the neighborhood said they feared Martha, describing her as cold, severe, and given to fits of cruelty when her partner Thomas was not around. Some claimed she looked at the children with something closer to resentment than affection, as if motherhood had been forced upon her rather than chosen. Doctors, too, began to doubt their earlier diagnoses. They noticed that the symptoms didn't fully match diphtheria or scarlet fever. The children's throats were scarred, their suffering unusually prolonged, and in one case, the rapid deterioration did not align with the illnesses they had recorded. Still, without concrete evidence, all anyone had were suspicions, and suspicions were not enough to accuse a stepmother of murder in early 20th century Perth. The turning point came when one of the surviving children, still living under Rendell's care, confided in neighbors about the pain caused by the medicine Martha administered. He described the burning sensation in his throat each time she spooned the syrup into his mouth, a detail that struck alarm in those who heard it. Word spread quickly, and soon local authorities were alerted. Investigators searched the home and found bottles containing hydrochloric acid, a substance used for household cleaning and industrial purposes, but never for medical treatment. Suddenly, the unexplained symptoms and repeated deaths made horrifying sense. Forensic analysis, rudimentary as it was at the time, confirmed that the throats of the deceased children bore burns consistent with acid exposure. The so-called medicine was not a remedy at all, but poison disguised with careful intent. The woman who had seemed to embody grief and maternal devotion was now revealed as the architect of her stepchildren's deaths. But here's where it gets even more unsettling. Martha never confessed. Even when confronted with the evidence, she maintained her composure, insisting she had only ever tried to care for the children. In court, prosecutors argued that her actions were deliberate, pointing to the repeated use of acid, the consistent pattern of symptoms, and her presence at every stage of the children's decline. Witnesses testified that she seemed fixated on the children's illnesses, sometimes speaking about their suffering with a strange detachment, as though observing rather than grieving. To the jury, the picture that emerged was not of a desperate woman making mistakes, but of a calculated killer who used the guise of medicine to exert control and cause death slowly, methodically, and in plain sight of those around her. Her trial gripped Perth, not just because of the horror of the crimes, but because it violated one of society's most sacred trusts, the expectation that a mother figure would protect rather than destroy. When Martha Rendell walked into the Supreme Court of Western Australia in 1909, the eyes of an entire colony were fixed on her. The woman accused of murdering her stepchildren through poison did not fit the image of a monster the public expected. She appeared calm, composed, even elegant in her black dresses, her posture straight as she listened to testimony that painted her as one of the most calculating women Australia had ever seen. Prosecutors laid out the chilling evidence: bottles of hydrochloric acid found in her possession, the scarred throats of the children, and the repeated pattern of illnesses that ended only when death arrived. Witnesses described her strict demeanor, her obsessive care at the children's bedsides, and the strange detachment she displayed as they wasted away. Doctors testified about the burns that acid would cause when ingested, linking the physical evidence directly to the alleged medicine Rendell had administered. To the jury, the pattern was undeniable. One child's death might have been a tragedy. 2, perhaps a grim coincidence. But 3, with identical symptoms and the same stepmother at the center of it all, could only mean intent. Her defense insisted she was innocent, a grieving woman wrongly accused by neighbors who never accepted her as part of the family. They claimed the deaths were due to common illnesses of the era and argued that the evidence was circumstantial, relying heavily on interpretation rather than certainty. But the jury was unconvinced. The image of 3 children, each suffering the same agonizing fate under Rendell's watch, weighed heavily on their deliberations. On October 6, 1909, Martha Rendell was convicted of the murder of her stepdaughter Annie, though she was suspected of killing at least 2 other children in the same manner. She was sentenced to death, making her one of the few women in Australian history to face the gallows. When the verdict was read, Rendell remained composed, showing no visible emotion, a calmness that unsettled observers who expected either tears or rage. Her execution took place on October 6, 1909, at Fremantle Prison. Reports from the day describe her walking to the gallows with quiet dignity, refusing to break down or confess, maintaining her innocence until the end. To some, her composure confirmed her guilt, proof of a woman so cold and calculating that she could face death without fear. To others, it left room for doubt, feeding speculation that she may have been unfairly judged by a society unwilling to accept a strict, independent woman in a maternal role. Over time, her case became a legend in Australian true crime, her name invoked as a warning about the dangers that can lurk inside the home. Some saw her as a female counterpart to notorious child killers abroad, while others whispered that she had been condemned as much for her personality as for her crimes. Regardless, her story endured because it broke one of society's most sacred expectations, that a mother, stepmother, or caregiver exists to protect children, not to harm them. In Martha Rendell's case, the role was inverted into something terrifying, a reminder that sometimes the most dangerous predator is not outside the home, but sitting by the bedside, holding the spoon and calling it medicine. 6 killers. 6 stories that prove the most terrifying predators are rarely the ones hiding in shadows. They're the ones hiding in plain sight. A factory worker no one suspected, a gentleman who lured women with promises of love, a stepmother with a spoon of medicine. Each one carried darkness behind the mask of ordinary life, and that's what makes them so disturbing. It's not just what they did, it's how long they got away with it. Tell me in the comments which case shocked you the most, and don't forget to subscribe, because there are always more stories like these waiting to be uncovered.